Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Examining Policies to Counter China. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome our members to this hearing on China, and I look forward to our testimony. From the very first Trump administration, many will recall a key China policy issue as the global race to 5G, and we urged caution to our foreign partners by both the executive and the legislative branch and our friends around the world about telecom infrastructure. We said there's a right way and there's a Huawei. And yet other technologies before it, 5G, showed that there's always a country that launches an innovation first isn't always the one that wins. Rather, it's the economy that's got the economic system to transform those technological advances into winning new products and services, resulting in economic and productivity gains. I open with this example of 5G because in a broader context of our economic and geopolitical rival with China, it's often neglected. Instead, narrow questions end up taking an existential importance. One day it's the race to 5G, the next day it's concern over a trendy Chinese app like TikTok, or today it's DeepSeek's ability to answer a question in more or less time than a US competitor. Of course, these things merit our close attention, but if these are the trees, then Congress really must still see the forest. For example, if we edge out China in artificial intelligence, but Washington prevents our companies from commercializing it, what happens? If we secure a 1-year lead in hypersonics, but a defense procurement obstacle course makes its deployment a pipe dream? What if we attract to our shores the greatest technical minds in the world, but our tangle of red tape regulations mean that their startups being taken public is out of the question? In short, winning a race is no substitute for choosing a better way of life with a better political and economic system. At our hearing today, we'll examine tools to counter China, but make no mistake, those tools are embedded in an American system, and it's the health of our thriving system that ultimately decides who will prevail. We will use sanctions, for example, but sanctions did not build a $30 trillion economy. We can use export controls, but it wasn't export controls that created 8 American exceptional technology companies, each worth more than $1 trillion. We can use the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., but CFIUS didn't make the dollar the world's premier reserve currency. Today's hearing is based on the idea that beating China means doubling down on American strengths. First, we must ensure that our federal budget, our fiscal house, is in order and on a sustainable path. Next, we must lead a global financial system where like-minded economies reject non-transparent, predatory lending and mercantilism while crafting and enforcing rules that safeguard economic growth and stability. Second, our investors, our markets, our institutions, both large and small, must be able to nurture cutting-edge ideas and help take them from friends and family-backed startups to an initial public offering. Third, we must ensure that access to capital is coupled with access to energy. That means the U.S. must champion an all-of-the-above energy strategy, offering real alternatives to failed Chinese lending and white elephants. And last but not least, our strength depends on prioritizing Americans' health and safety of our hometowns and our cities, which have been so devastated by an opioid surge that China has helped unleash. Each of these elements is key to any real China strategy, and it's critical that they're all addressed today. And I yield back, and the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, the gentlewoman from California, for a 4-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. This is very important. Good morning, everyone. I and committee Democrats have long recognized the national security concerns and threats of to our economy from the Chinese Communist Party. We're very supportive of efforts to prevent Wall Street from investing Americans' hard-earned savings in the Chinese military. I've also pressed for the United States to use and influence at the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other multilateral institutions to stop the worst lending, contracting, and other industrial practices of China. But, Mr. Chair, while I would love to work with you in a bipartisan way to advance efforts to stop China's aggression, I'm concerned that our efforts would be meaningless as President Trump and his unelected billionaire co-president Elon Musk destroy the United States government and our alliances. In just the past month, Trump has imposed import taxes on our closest allies, frozen aid for impoverished nations, illegally shuttered USAID and CFPB, and threatened to illegally seize Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. Inexplicably, he has also sided with Russia's President Putin over allies in Ukraine and Europe, withholding military assistance and blaming Russia's murderous invasion on the victims of its war. As Trump tears up treaties and alliances, embraces dictators, and abandons America's global leadership role, he is giving China a free pass to fill the void left by his retreat. We're here to talk about China and discuss bills about countering Chinese government aggression, all while Trump, Musk, and some congressional Republicans give China the green light to seize other of our allies, such as Taiwan. Trump and Musk have so eagerly sold out America's values and workers to China because they are singularly focused on billionaire tax cuts and amassing more personal wealth. As it stands, Elon Musk makes billions in China, where more than half of Tesla vehicles are produced. Nearly 40% of Tesla's battery supply relies on Chinese companies, and Chinese buyers represent Elon Musk's largest market, while Tesla sales continue to collapse in the United States. Last year, there was a 90% increase in China, and Trump is ready to forcibly remove Gazans to build golf courses for Trump and his billionaire friends and investors, just as the CCP, that is the Chinese Communist Party, forced removal of Uyghurs from their land. Racist nationalism, anti-democratic activity, and even genocide and war are not a concern if it means power and wealth for them and their billionaire class. While this is to be expected from people like Musk and Trump, I'm deeply disappointed that my Republican colleagues, many of whom have previously been outspoken about the important role the U.S. plays as a beacon of freedom and defender of democracies around the globe. Republicans did not even speak up when the Trump Pentagon refused to allow one of its trafficking experts to join us today to speak about Chinese fentanyl procurers and Chinese money laundering. Committee Democrats believe that together we can solve the world's greatest problems. To counter China, we must stand with our allies and fight for a vibrant, effective democracy with respect civil servants who carry out our foreign policy. Democrats will not rest until we stop the unlawful effort to dismantle our government here and overseas. Hopefully, our Republican colleagues will come to their senses and join us in this effort. And thank you for the additional time, Mr. Chair.
The gentlewoman yields back. Today we welcome the testimony of John Miller, Senior Vice President of Policy, Trust, Data and Technology, and General Counsel of the Information Technology Industry Council. Nicholas McMurray, the Managing Director of International and Nuclear Policy at ClearPath. John Cassara, a retired special agent, formerly with the United States Treasury Department. Martin Mueisen, a non-resident senior fellow at the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council, and Dr. Rush Doshi at the CV Star Senior Fellow for Asian Studies and Director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations, and an assistant professor at Georgetown University. We thank each of you for taking time to be with us today. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, your written statements will all be made of the record. Mr. Miller, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, and distinguished members of the committee, on behalf of the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on examining U.S. policies to counter China. This is a timely topic, and I commend the committee for its thoughtful and sustained engagement in this area. ITI is a global policy and advocacy organization representing 80 of the world's leading tech companies, and I lead ITI's Trust Data and Technology Policy team, including our work on security, artificial intelligence, and data policy in the United States and globally. ITI's members represent every vertical of the tech ecosystem, from cloud and AI to consumer electronics, from semiconductors and data centers to cybersecurity. Our membership represents around 10% of the U.S. GDP, directly employs 9 million Americans, and accounts for roughly 32% of the market capitalization of the S&P 500. As of 2024, there were 7 companies that had reached or exceeded global market cap of $1 trillion. 6 of those 7 are U.S. tech companies who are ITI members. Policymakers should recognize the preeminence of these companies and the innovation economy they anchor as an asset and the envy of other nations. Indeed, the strength of the innovation economy bolsters the broader U.S. economy and drives the U.S. competitive advantage in tools and capabilities that underpin U.S. national security, such as semiconductors, AI, quantum, and advanced manufacturing. Do not take for granted the current U.S. technology lead over China. China's longstanding disregard for international norms governing free trade and market access and its theft of IP has been well established and must be addressed. However, regardless of whether China plays by the rules, we should be clear-eyed that over the past 2 decades, China has improved in technological development, innovation, and growth, and that these gains have not been achieved simply by virtue of stealing U.S. technology. Make no mistake, ITI and the companies we represent take seriously the U.S. government's obligation to protect national security. Successful policies to counter China's technological rise must enable companies to better compete globally, not wall the United States off from competing with China or inadvertently erect hurdles to U.S. tech innovation and investment. U.S. investment, supply chain, tax, and trade policies and regulations must be crafted to maintain the current asymmetric advantage as a key driver of U.S. economic security. We believe the government and industry must work together to achieve these objectives in a way that supports the innovation, investment, and economic growth that are foundational elements of economic security. This morning, ITI released a paper offering our members consensus policy recommendations for U.S. economic security. Our paper defines economic security as encompassing elements of the economy that affect the stability, technological competitiveness, and resilience that enable the government to better protect national security. The ideal policy environment to foster U.S. economic security is one in which the global success of American and multinational companies operating in the U.S. supports technological leadership and innovation, and the government and private sector work side by side to safeguard critical technologies. Our paper, which is incorporated as part of my written statement, offers 10 recommendations, 3 of which I will highlight now. First, in the area of financial policy, investment and transaction reviews should strengthen economic ties with allies by establishing clear and targeted national security criteria for what is reviewable. Capital investments, both inbound and outbound, are foundational and help companies in the United States diversify the supply chain, engage the research and development ecosystem, gain access to global talent, and gather global market intelligence. Overly broad investment restrictions, whether through CFIUS or the Outbound Investment Security Program, will impede domestic and overseas investment in and by U.S. companies and consequently decrease economic security. Second, reinvigorate U.S. trade leadership and open new markets to optimize for both trade and economic security. ITI encourages the U.S. government to negotiate robust binding commitments that facilitate trade through new strategic and targeted bilateral and multilateral market access agreements to enable U.S. companies to compete on an even playing field. Third, continue to incentivize innovation and investment in foundational and emerging technology. One near-term priority should be restoring the immediate tax deduction of R&D expenses to drive innovation and create high-wage jobs in the United States. Another should be maintaining and improving the CHIPS program by pursuing meaningful permitting reform and streamlined reporting requirements. Doing so will help promote these multi-billion-dollar investments in semiconductors, the building blocks of the modern digital economy, as a strategic economic security asset. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. McMurray, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify today. My name is Nico McMurray, and I'm the Managing Director of International and Nuclear Policy at ClearPath. At ClearPath, we believe in markets over mandates and innovation over regulation. When it comes to energy, we want to make it here, sell it globally, and compete with China. The global energy landscape is rapidly evolving. Demand growth is skyrocketing.
Could you pull your mic a little closer, please?
Yes. Supply chains are shifting, and we are in a global competition. Countries want more reliable, affordable, and cleaner energy to fuel their economies. This is a major opportunity for U.S. companies to lead. Strategic financing tools can help the U.S. strengthen its energy leadership, open new markets, and counter China. Let me put this into context. China currently has 57 operating nuclear reactors and 28 reactors under construction. While the U.S. has 94 operating reactors, it currently has no commercial reactors under construction, but several demonstrations are close. The world's electricity consumption is at an all-time high. The International Energy Agency says global electricity demand could increase up to 76%, and we could see a double in U.S. electricity demand by 2050. American private sector innovation is the key and extends beyond domestic borders. Take advancements in LNG, for example. In 2023, the U.S. surged its LNG exports. As a result, Russia's market share in the EU was reduced from 40% in 2021 to 8% in 2023. There is also a huge economic opportunity for American companies and other technologies. If the U.S. doesn't act now, the world will choose cheap options from China. China is already taking an all-of-the-above energy approach. For example, last year, China started construction on about 94 gigawatts of coal capacity and also invested $940 billion in clean energy. Without a focused effort to expand domestic energy production, U.S. companies risk being sidelined in global markets. To level the playing field, the U.S. must strengthen its trade and development finance toolkit. Export and development financing plays a pivotal role in advancing America's strategy for global energy dominance. XM and DFC can strengthen U.S. leadership in global energy markets. America must take a more agile approach, using financing tools to de-risk projects and attract private capital. Export and development finance prioritizes investments in infrastructure, manufacturing, energy security, and economic partnerships. XM and DFC provide loans and guarantees that must be repaid, ensuring taxpayer dollars are used efficiently while expanding opportunities for U.S. businesses. This approach creates American jobs, strengthens economic ties, and positions the U.S. as the global energy partner. Both the XM Bank and DFC are due for reauthorization this Congress, creating a prime opportunity to refine America's foreign policy toolkit. While XM is one of the best tools for increasing export competitiveness, its current capabilities limit the bank from achieving energy dominance. The following 5 recommendations could bolster U.S. energy leadership, enhance energy security, and create domestic jobs. First, create a national interest account to consider the geostrategic value of investments. Second, expand the China and Transformational Exports Program to include broader technologies. Third, increase the default cap rate for nuclear projects. Fourth, reinforce the U.S. jobs mandate. Fifth, bolster domestic manufacturing. And overall, modernize the bank's mission. I would be remiss if I didn't mention DFC's reauthorization this year. Created during the first Trump administration to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, DFC has established itself as an effective tool in countering China. For example, it now supports nuclear projects after removing its nuclear moratorium in 2020. The World Bank also plays a critical role, but its outdated policies have left a gap that China has eagerly exploited, particularly its self-imposed restrictions on financing nuclear power. In order to achieve energy dominance, the government must provide a predictable environment for developers to attract private investment. The work of this committee will be critical to providing stability for companies seeking to raise capital and compete globally. In conclusion, The U.S. must build domestically and sell globally to compete with China. Meeting growing energy demand and strengthening global energy leadership requires bold action. And finally, Congress has a unique opportunity to strengthen American solutions by modernizing export and development financing to support nuclear, LNG, geothermal, and other technologies. I look forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Cassara, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, and distinguished members of the Financial Services Committee. It's an honor for me to testify. Communist China is an ideological, military, economic, commercial, high-tech, intelligence, and diplomatic rival of the United States in the West. The People's Republic of China has a growing exploitative presence in the developing world. While these threats are known, the Chinese Communist Party's involvement in transnational crime and money laundering is generally not recognized, understood, or investigated. My most recent book is China, Specified Unlawful Activities, CCP Inc., Transnational Crime and Money Laundering. I found in writing that book that criminal activity has seemingly become part of the CCP's overall strategy to grow its power. Regarding fentanyl, the Mexican cartels are still dependent on Chinese precursor chemicals and manufacturing expertise. Fentanyl and fentanyl-laced products are smuggled into the United States. In calendar year 2023 alone, the DEA seized more than 77 million fentanyl pills and nearly 12,000 pounds of fentanyl powder. This is the most fentanyl the DEA has ever seized in a single year, and more than enough to kill every single American. As it is, in 2023, more than 107,000 Americans lost their lives to drug overdose, with 70% of those deaths attributed to opioids such as fentanyl. Each death is a tragedy. Each individual that died has a story. Families and communities are devastated. The scourge affects every one of the members' districts and our country as a whole. But of course, it all comes back to the money. Fentanyl production generates enormous proceeds, and Chinese are becoming the money launderers of choice for the cartels. They leverage an underground banking system that has long served China's immigrant diaspora. They have developed other Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies that enable the laundering of their illicit proceeds, not only in the United States, but around the world. In my written statement, I give an overview of some of the most pernicious enablers as they relate to fentanyl trafficking, such as trade-based money laundering, black market exchanges, underground financial systems like Faichen or Flying Money, and mirror swaps that are facilitated by Chinese mobile phone apps. While my testimony focuses on U.S. efforts to counter illicit fentanyl trafficking and money laundering, I urge that we do not look at the fentanyl issue in a vacuum or as an isolated concern. The CCP's business model that fuels the fentanyl crisis is also active in many other sectors of crime, including counterfeit goods, intellectual property theft, human trafficking, illicit tobacco, and trade fraud. In fact, data indicates that China leads the world in 11 of the 12 largest categories of transnational crime. Each of these categories are also specified unlawful activities or predicate offenses to charge money laundering. CCP Inc.'s involvement in these crimes is approximately $2 trillion a year. To put that in perspective, $2 trillion is very roughly half the estimated $4 trillion that is laundered annually around the world. I call corruption the great enabler for money laundering. CCP Inc. has taken their domestic corruption and exported it overseas. They excel in so-called influence operations, which is probably a major reason for the lack of focus on CCP Inc.'s criminality and money laundering. Once again, these specified unlawful activities, methodologies, and enablers cannot be viewed in isolation. Rather, they are intertwined and must be addressed collectively. CCP international law breaking makes them exposed. It makes them vulnerable. I conclude my written testimony with recommendations that emphasize law enforcement and more effectively following the money and value trails. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Eisen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Waters, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me today. My name is Martin Mühleisen. Before joining the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, I retired from the International Monetary Fund in 2021, having served as Chief of Staff and Director for Strategy, Policy and Review, among others. The following are my personal views, not those of the Atlantic Council or any other organization. On the topic of multilateral institutions, I would like to focus on 3 recommendations. First, China should be held responsible for its bad lending decisions. Chinese loans have contributed to rising debt vulnerabilities in low-income countries. In several cases, their unsustainable debt put a hold on new loans by multilateral lenders. The speed of debt workouts has picked up in recent years, but China remains unwilling to provide haircuts to restore solvency when needed. The United States should encourage the IMF to make full use of its debt policies when countries need deeper debt restructuring. For example, under certain conditions, the IMF's lending into official arrears policy allows programs to proceed even if a country is in default to another IMF member. A more robust application of this policy could strengthen the negotiation position of debtor countries, eliciting more ambitious debt relief from China. Second, focus on quality, not quantity, of multilateral programs. The World Bank and other development banks have been leveraging their capital base to increase lending to low-income countries, who also benefited from a $650 billion issue of IMF special drawing rights. These efforts are intended to meet large financing needs of poorer countries, often with relatively little conditionality. Higher debt to multilateral institutions, however, can drive out private lenders, resulting in the end in higher dependence on China. To attract private capital, the institution's main focus should therefore be on raising countries' long-term growth prospects, including through loan conditionality. But stepped-up lending by multilateral organizations alone will not win the struggle for hearts and minds in the global South. The United States should work with multilateral lenders to incentivize needed reforms. If multilateral programs were flanked by co-financing, investment funds, specific trade preferences, or private capital, they would have a larger chance of succeeding. Especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, with their growing populations, this could unlock important markets for US exports in the future. Third, protect the dominant role of the dollar. Large emerging markets have exhibited a remarkable degree of economic stability in recent years. Countries among this group are still vulnerable to external shocks. However, in case of a severe crisis, some may need access to US dollar sources to avoid sharp devaluations, and their financing needs could be large. In this case, the IMF could deploy its lending capacity, its full lending capacity, of around $1 trillion to avoid contagion and preserve global financial stability. This amount leverages the United States' contribution to the IMF by a factor of more than 5 to 1. In the absence of this safety net, countries would either have to acquire additional foreign exchange reserves, putting upward pressure on the US dollar, or they would need to seek help from China, which could become a factor in undermining US dollar dominance over the long term. It would therefore be in the US interest if Congress ratified the increase in IMF quotas agreed last year, which would provide a stronger capital cushion and make loans available at short notice if needed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Doshi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Waters, distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. I'll focus my remarks on 4 questions related to China. First, what are Beijing's economic and technology ambitions? Second, what is its strategy to achieve them? Third, how is its strategy working? And finally, what should we do about it? So first, what are Beijing's ambitions? The PRC has a grand strategy to displace US-led order. It seeks to catch up and surpass the US technologically, to reduce dependence on others while increasing their dependence on China economically, and to acquire the capability to defeat US forces militarily. Beijing believes economic and technology competition is about power, not prosperity. It believes there have been 4 industrial revolutions that determined the fate of nations. The first was steam power, which led to British dominance. The second and third were electrification and mass manufacturing, which led to American dominance, and now we're in the 4th, AI, quantum computing, smart manufacturing, biotechnology, which China aims to win. Second, what is Beijing's economic and technology strategy? There are 3 parts. First, Beijing acquires technology. It buys foreign companies to get it, or it forces them to transfer it in exchange for market access, or it steals it outright through human intelligence and cyber espionage. Second, Beijing protects its companies. It uses tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and exchange rate manipulation to keep out foreign competition. Third, Beijing wields industrial policy. It uses massive industry support, subsidies, tax breaks, R&D support, cheap credit, state investment, so that its companies can undercut rivals on price. Taken together, PRC companies will lose money in their home market. They'll lose money in foreign markets, but they'll use that to win both their home and foreign markets, and eventually, they know they can stay solvent longer than foreign rivals that don't have similar state backing. Dominance in one sector then helps them climb the ladder to the next rung. The scale of China's industrial policy efforts is breathtaking. Beijing likely stole more than $1 trillion worth of US intellectual property. Its industrial support is about 2% of the PRC economy every year. That's a conservative estimate, but it's more than any other country around the world. It's twice as much as US support. It's probably about $400 billion a year. And that's more in comparison to the Chips and Science Act, which is about $50 billion over multiple years. So third, is this strategy working? In short, yes. In the last 2 decades after China joined the WTO, the US share of global manufacturing fell by half, from 30% to 15%. That so-called China shock cost millions of jobs and shuttered thousands of factories. Meanwhile, in the exact same period, China's share of global manufacturing quintupled from 6% to 30%. China is a manufacturing superpower. Its capacity exceeds that of the next 9 countries combined, and it can leverage that manufacturing dominance to innovate and to gain military advantage. Take innovation. China is at the leading edge of fields like robotics, AI, and quantum computing. It leads the US in high-impact patents and scientific papers. It accounts for half of all industrial robot installations worldwide, 60% of all global electric vehicle production, 75% of global battery production, and over 90% of solar panel, rare earth, and antibiotic production. And then take the military competition. The PRC has 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States and is leading in new technologies like hypersonics. Now, Beijing's economy has problems. It's slowing, its population is aging, but we shouldn't feel confident. Beijing is pouring money into industry and exports to find growth, and that strategy is causing a second China shock that's deindustrializing economies around the world, including our own. So fourth and finally, what do we do about it? Well, first, we can't go it alone. China surpasses the US on some industrial metrics, but the US, combined with its allies and partners, has 3 times China's GDP, half of all global manufacturing, more than twice China's likely military spending, twice China's patents and top-cited publications and massive market power. If we pull our markets, protect our technology, coordinate our research, and create defensive barriers to PRC excess capacity, we can handily weather the second China shock and reindustrialize and lead in technology. Second, we need new institutions. The US could benefit from a federal industrial investment bank that can make long-term loans, take equity in strategic industries, and most importantly, coordinate with private capital. That could allow us to also fund reshoring from China to the US or to allied countries. Third, we need to change incentives. China can play the long game while our companies focus on quarterly earning cycles. We can consider tax policies to change that. We also need to invest more in basic science research, where China outspends the United States now. And finally, we have to play defense. That involves calibrated tariffs to protect our industry from excess capacity from China. It requires stronger export controls, research protection, and regulation of inbound and outbound investment to maintain our lead. The US has never faced an adversary quite as formidable technologically and industrially as China. But we have everything that we need to succeed. We just have to make different choices in some cases. I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mrs. Beatty, the ranking member of the National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions Subcommittee, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me say I'd like to echo Ranking Member Waters' comments and note the incredible irony of us holding this hearing while Team Trump-Musk are presiding. It is, and they are demolishing the United States leadership on the international stage. The White House and DOJ are illegally deleting entire agencies in violation of the Constitution, siding with adversaries, calling our allies dictators, and abruptly and ruthlessly rescinding U.S. aid that fosters global goodwill and advance our national security goals, all which is unquestionably allows China to fill the void and hands them the prize of global leadership on a silver platter. All while colleagues across the aisle have a long record in Congress of loudly supporting soft powers initiatives like USAID and assistance for Ukraine are stunningly silent now. This is unthinkable, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Lewison, the IMF last major report on China comes from 2024 on their economy, and it reads like it's a parallel universe to me. The report says, quote, directors, meaning IMF directors, positively noted that China is a key player in addressing global challenges and welcomed its constructive role in supporting sovereign debt restructuring in low-income and vulnerable countries and tackling the global climate crisis. That's a quote from the report. They also emphasized China's important role in strengthening multilateral trading system in close cooperation with international partners. That sounds preposterous to me. Mr. Mulhausen, what's your view on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, and I'm not speaking for my colleagues, I want to just emphasize that, for my former colleagues. I think that the staff report wanted to point out that China did make some progress on the debt restructuring issue. There has been improvements, as I mentioned earlier, because China is participating under the G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring, and some country cases have been resolved.
But you wouldn't argue that the common framework has been successful, would you?
It has been a difficult effort to get China to contribute. It is not like the Paris Club, but it has some of the same principles.
Shouldn't China belong to the Paris Club? Shouldn't they participate in the Paris Club?
I would welcome if they did.
Wouldn't that make all this a lot easier, and we wouldn't have to have a made-up framework like the common framework from the G20?
I think I pointed out in my statement that I think there are still shortcomings in the way China does handle its loans to troubled countries. And I would agree that having them in the Paris Club would make them play with the rules that are well established and functioning. But obviously, this is China's own decision. I think at some point they considered it, but it was then rejected within China.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it was a mistake, and I think the IMF and the IMF members should put more pressure on China to participate through the Paris Club. What should the IMF be doing now as it relates to this past 4 years of effort that really hasn't been very successful?
As I mentioned, I think the only real tool that the IMF has is the lending into official arrears policy.
Do they have the right information from the countries they're trying to lend to if the terms that China has are not transparent and are not disclosed?
There has been some improvement in disclosure, but again, I don't want to put my hand in the fire and say that everybody knows exactly what China is doing in member countries. That improvement has helped especially bring private creditors on board, because now there's more of a level playing field. Now people understand more what the mass of loans is and how to negotiate that restructuring, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you. Mr. McMurray, I was pleased to be sponsoring in this Congress a bipartisan bill with Mr. Torres of New York that would support nuclear energy financing through the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. This legislation would not only help lift the World Bank's prohibition on same financing, but it would kickstart a trust fund to add in the assistance that you referenced in your good testimony. I'd like to cite in the record 2 articles I've written on the importance on nuclear financing. Build Back Nuclear from 2021 and Our Energy Future from January 2025. Without objection, they'll be added to the record. Mr. McMurray, can you help us understand why funding for nuclear and other energy projects is so critical in countering China's influence in the world?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. China is actively building almost 30 nuclear reactors today, poising them to prepare to export and build their technologies elsewhere. The World Bank has a really important role to fund large global infrastructure projects. So by them not supporting nuclear, that limits the effectiveness of the World Bank and cedes that leadership to China. As you mentioned, the trust fund is actually an excellent tool for the World Bank to do 2 things. 1, build that internal expertise, so it can start educating its own staff as well as its members. And then 2, lay out some of those early stage projects so ultimately entities like the EXIM Bank can start funding and support additional projects globally.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. I now yield to the ranking member of the full committee for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Doshi, in the Caribbean, nations increasingly disillusioned by the United States' unpredictability are turning to what is known as BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, including, of course, both in a very, very real way, China and Russia, for investment and financial support. China's Belt and Road Initiative have brought investments to the region from ports and energy resources to hotels and highways, although often with predatory loan arrangements. In light of these developments, what strategic actions should the United States take to counterbalance China's growing influence and provide a more reliable, attractive alternative for Caribbean nations and other regions? I just want you to know that when any of us participate in activities with our Caribbean countries, that's all we hear. What are you guys doing? Can't you help us to avoid what China is doing in the Caribbean? What do you know about this?
Well, thank you very much, Ranking Member Waters. Let me just say this is a very important issue. Every great power adversary the U.S. has ever faced has wanted a role in the Caribbean, whether that was Germany and even the First World War, but especially the Second, or the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And China's no different. They also want a role in the Caribbean because they know it's a weak spot for us potentially. They know about our reliance on the Panama Canal. So the history here shows that China will want to be involved, and if you look at their own statements, you know it. I would add a few things. China's involvement picked up really in the early 2000s. They've accelerated their involvement in recent years, and as you correctly noted, they are focused on a whole of government approach in the Caribbean. That means military assistance in some cases to Caribbean countries. That means law enforcement and military assistance. It also means investment, significant investment in Jamaica, investment in port infrastructure, including the operation of ports in the Caribbean. And so they're there, they're present, and in many ways their economic relationship is growing rapidly. Tourism is another component. What do we do about it? There are a few things. First, a little bit of support from us goes a long way. These are not large economies. Taken together, the entire GDP of the region is about the GDP of Kansas, maybe a little bit less. So we can do more by being present and by increasing our aid activity. Second, Caribbean countries, as you know well, want commercial engagement with the United States. We should find ways to make it easier, whether that's through EXIM, DFC, or other institutions, for our businesses to be involved in the Caribbean. But finally, we should remember that we have an asymmetric advantage. Those countries, as you noted, they want to be with us, not with China. And they're not happy about the corruption that China sometimes brings to their economies. So transparency and sunlight is the best disinfectant. We should fight in the information space so people know that we stand for anti-corruption and that the Chinese stand for corruption. Finally, we have to worry about the military role that China is building there, and we should make sure that our Department of Defense is doing everything it can to strengthen military diplomacy with our Caribbean friends.
Thank you very much. In speaking about what more we can do, some of our Caribbean island states do not receive foreign aid because they say they make a little bit too much money. But you know, they're hit with storms and they're in great debt as they try to reconstruct and renovate and all of that. Is this an area that we could help them in because of the debt that is incurred with all of these Mother Nature events?
Well, thank you very much, Ranking Member Waters. You brought an important point up, which is debt. Many of these countries are heavily indebted to China, increasingly indebted. Jamaica is another good example of that. In many cases, Suriname is another recent example. In many cases, they can't pay back the debt. So that's a problem, and it speaks to the previous discussion earlier about China's non-participation in the Paris Club. But I would just add that, yes, storm relief, we can do more there. And finally, very quickly, we might want to consider changing the thresholds for aid for some of these countries so that we can make sure we can be more useful to them.
Thank you very much. And quickly, do we have a security problem with China getting so much, influence in the Caribbean and being so close to us? Should we be concerned about that?
We should, in my opinion. It somewhat compromises some of the activities that we undertake in the Caribbean. We have Southcom operations and others that are worried about this. But in particular, I'd note just two things. First, that the PRC operates out of Cuba, a number of sensitive sites, and we should worry about those and their ability to collect on our operations in the Caribbean. And second, I would also add to that the PRC's ownership of port infrastructure in the region, including around the Panama Canal, can pose security threats, as the Trump administration and the Biden administration have identified.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan, the Vice Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Heisinger, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Hey, everybody. I want to get to IMF reform and some things, but Mr. Doshi, I want to very, very quickly hit on this because I learned a new phrase recently, which is the lie flat generation in China. And my question is, can China survive economically from the downturn that they are seeing? And it seems to me, as a child of the Cold War and that era, the difference between our space race and the Cold War race that we had with Russia is they had a much smaller economy. So I'm very curious, very quickly, your view on China with that.
Thank you, Congressman. It's a very important question. And very quickly, I would say that yes, they can survive. We have generally underestimated China's ability to compete, but very importantly, China has scale. And every rising power that has scale tends to do pretty well. The Soviets did not have the scale China does. I'm happy to go into more detail.
Okay, all right. Mr. Muehlheisen, I want to turn to you about your work at IMF and your views from the IMF, not necessarily your particular work there, but according to the Wilson Center, 80% of China's government-supported loans are to countries that are in some sort of debt stress. The IMF has failed to convince China to work on restricting this debt, which some estimate in excess of $1 trillion. To me, having worked with IMF and World Bank and others over the years, I would argue it seems to be a strategy, not a coincidence, that oftentimes they are lending into these countries that have a debt strain, and then they are then utilizing the loan documents and the profile of that to then flip that into an asset that they either control or own. So my question is what role should these IFIs play here? Should they simply just back away from countries with debt sustainability is unclear?
Thank you, Congressman. I would put it this way. I don't see China engaging in some kind of a debt trap, if that's what you meant, where they entrap countries so that they...
I think a clear-eyed look at what's happening in Africa and the rest of Asia would contradict that.
What I would rather how I would rather look at it is that they're getting a lot of benefits out of that engagement, because what they do is, of course, they have these trade relations also with countries.
So are you saying that they have a higher risk profile than the rest of the world does?
To some extent, I think China was not even aware of the risks they got into, and I could speak to that in a second. But what I meant is the strategic advantages they're getting, access to ports,
Yes.
access to other facilities.
Including
I
in
think,
Latin America and other places
yeah,
now.
exactly, Caribbean. That is, I think, the main benefit. It's not like they would kind of own then a port that a country has to hand over because they can't pay their debt.
Staying with you, in your testimony, you mentioned that the United States should insist on, quote, unquote, quote, improved transparency at the IMF. And I'm also curious, what can the U.S. Treasury do to encourage the IMF to adopt a more forceful approach, including that transparency?
So I didn't mean to say that the U.S. should push the IMF to be more transparent. It's actually the debt transparency of China that needs.
Yes, I understand that, but the IMF is the tool for that, correct?
Yeah. So I myself.
So is the IMF doing enough to push that transparency and to push China, a country like China to give that transparency?
I've myself worked with Chinese officials in my former capacity to help them understand how much actually countries are owed to China, because within China, their facilities as lenders of all these different institutions that are lending are kind of not as far developed as we in the West would have it. They're not kind of set up to do that. They're only slowly getting into the business of lending.
I've got 45 seconds. I think the Chinese are far better business people than what you seem to be implying. But the latest shareholder review at the IMF did not increase China's voting power. They were pushing to do so. What conditions should the IMF insist on if China lobbies for more shares would be a question, but I'm going to actually get that in writing because I do have to hit this, Mr. Chairman. I previously introduced a bill, the IMF Reform and Integrity Act, that would prevent any shareholder increase at the IMF for a country such as the PRC that does not meet basic obligations codified in the organization's Articles of Agreement. So I believe, and this goes back to my time working with Madame Lagarde when she was there, the IMF needs to get tougher and tighter about enforcing its own rules. So I'd like to submit a copy of my bill to the
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, the ranking member on the Small Business Committee, Ms. Vasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start off by saying that I am glad we're having this hearing discussing the rising threat of China. But holding this hearing is not enough. If we want to talk about countering China, then we need to be discussing how President Trump and his unelected president, Elon Musk, are the biggest threat to the United States in countering China. President Trump has abandoned our closest allies in favor of cozying up to dictators, illegally closed down U.S. AID and cutting off aid for needy nations, destroyed our national security apparatus, and installed conspiracy theorists like Kash Patel at the top levels of our government. Dismantling this institution that have helped keep our nation and the world safe since World War II opened the door for China. Countries across Africa and Latin America are turning to China for financing and leadership, a geopolitical move China is facilitating and exploiting. Mr. Cassara, by hollowing out the government through illegal firings and layoffs, Elon Musk and Doge are making Americans less safe from financial scams coming from China and encouraging corruption both home and abroad. An article printed in the Wall Street Journal, not exactly a bastion of liberal media, last week describes how illegal proceeds from fentanyl sales are being laundered through China for reinvestment in real estate and other vehicles here in the United States. The proceeds and flow of illegal fentanyl from China is an issue members on both sides of the aisle care about. How can Congress bolster current BSA AML statutes to reduce the reinvestment of illegal fentanyl proceeds here in the U.S.?
Thank you for the question. Regarding BSA, Bank Secrecy Act, financial intelligence reporting requirements, I think one of the best things that could happen to to counteract some of the issues that you're developing is for real estate agents, for example, to no longer be exempted from KYC, know your customer reporting requirements, and to follow suspicious activity reports. I think something else needs to be done that is more efficient utilization of suspicious activity reports in general, which is going to require additional personnel, it's going to require technology, and most importantly, it's going to require additional resources on the ground for agents to work cases.
And wouldn't you agree that to reduce the laundering of money from Chinese fentanyl sales, we are going to need to continue to crack down on anonymous shell companies here in the U.S.?
Absolutely. In money laundering, there are 3 stages of money laundering: placement, layering, and integration. Shell companies, LLCs, Delaware corporations, whatever you want to call them, are one of the premier tools of choice by money launderers in the layering stage of money laundering. It makes it very, very difficult for criminal investigators to follow the money trail. Same thing in the integration stage. Once the money is layered and integrated into the economy, we don't know who owns that shopping center, who owns that yacht, who owns that property. We need beneficial ownership information.
Thank you for that answer. Dr. Doshi, how important is it for both the U.S. and allied nations to adopt and enforce transparency measures like beneficial ownership registries and anti-corruption laws to prevent bad actors from abusing our financial system?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. I think it's incredibly important. Every step that we want to take, whether on law enforcement, with anti-money laundering, or with export controls, or with investment restrictions, all of those steps are going to require knowing essentially the beneficial owner. If we don't have that, then the PRC can always set up shell companies and get around our restrictions, and they've been doing that. So I think it's indispensable to our competitiveness agenda.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, the chair of the Task Force on Monetary Policy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying today. As the former chairman of the Science Committee and representing an energy-dominant state, I'm particularly sensitive to how China weaponizes energy as a geopolitical tool. The United States must continue to prioritize targeted investments in clean, reliable, and affordable nuclear energy, which will contribute to an enhanced energy security, geopolitical stability, and emissions reductions. Mr. McMurray, can you touch on why maintaining U.S. leadership in energy production is so critical to countering China in energy security national issues?
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership on clean energy innovation, especially as former chair of SST. China is actively building projects, and right now, countries around the world want and need more energy for either energy access or as they're just having more manufacturing or as they're growing. And so they're going to look at whatever options are cheap and available, and right now, in many cases, that is China. And so the U.S. has to look at how does the government support private companies, which are developing all sorts of innovative technologies, such as nuclear energy, to be able to make it easier to compete on an unlevel playing field. Some of the best tools are XM and DFC to kind of help with that financing piece, but ultimately we have to be able to make these technologies here and build them here, and that requires support from the Department of Energy and the national labs so we can demonstrate these technologies so we can ultimately sell them.
Thank you. Authorities at the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics have identified transnational criminals that are moving illicit drugs on the black market and laundering money in China. Mr. Cazzara, how can Congress address the financial streams that are the foundation of this illegal activity so we can cut off this very sophisticated criminal enterprises? And I know it's a complex question.
It's a complex question, but I think to get to the heart of the matter, I think we've made a mistake over the last so many years. Our enforcement agencies have been putting emphasis on what I call the product, for example, illegal drugs, and the people, meaning like drug kingpins and those involved with it. I think what we've been missing is to really, truly, finally go after the money, because all of these organizations are motivated by greed, avarice, and the way to hurt these individuals and these organizations better than anything is to identify their assets and take them away. The reason we haven't been doing this is because going after the money is hard. Enforcement agencies are statistic-driven, metric-driven. They want measurements of success. Instead of going after meaningful, long-term, complex money laundering investigations that take 2 years or more, they are content to go after these quickie little buy-bust cases that really don't make any difference. We have to change the incentives for law enforcement.
Play chess, not checkers.
Yes.
Turning back to the XM Bank for a moment, Mr. McMurray, in the most recent authorization of XM, Congress built the China Transformational Exports Program, or CTEP. That program reserves at least 20% of XM's authority to neutralize China's export subsidies. How can we improve on that program and scale it up to match their actions?
Thank you, Congressman. CTEP has been an excellent tool to compete with the very competitive financing that China is able to offer. Right now, CTEP focuses on only a certain subset of technologies. One of the best ways to increase the competitiveness of U.S. companies is to expand that. For example, including nuclear energy as part of CTEP's mandate. I would also want to just mention DFC was also created under the first Trump administration directly as a counter to China's Belt and Road. And there is an opportunity as well to strengthen DFC to make U.S. companies, again, more competitive.
I just want to simply note in my closing comments, we cannot afford to get caught flat-footed on the issues we're discussing today. And outcompeting China in export markets, financing energy investments must be a top priority. And I'm thankful of the chairman for focusing on this in our hearing today. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lucas yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, the ranking member on our Capital Markets Subcommittee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of our witnesses seem to be here advocating what they'd advocate in any other committee that wasn't even talking about China. If you're paid to convince Congress to let you drill for oil in Yellowstone National Park, you can then come to a hearing on China and say, well, that's the way to take care of China. Mr. Chairman, thank you for focusing on the importance of the U.S.'s world reserve currency. And we should remember that the announced purpose of crypto is to partially displace the U.S. dollar, and there is a bill in the Senate to make crypto the reserve currency of the dollar. And I think you understand how important it is that nothing displace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Likewise, I think it was Mr. Cassandra who focused on money laundering. Crypto is advocated by its own supporters as a way to do massive transactions or large transactions out of the view of the U.S. government. And that's perhaps why 100% of the ransomware attacks in recent years have demand payment in crypto. Mr. Muhlenson, I hear what you say about China debt. Too many small countries are being told, well, you borrowed China's money, so you have to give us your port. What we need to do is say to every lender and every credit rating agency that when China makes an unfair loan and you don't repay, that can't be used against the country's credit rating. So that countries who face in this circumstance will, instead of giving China their port, they can give China their middle finger and still borrow from American corporations, banks, and international lending institutions. We've made some unforced errors. One of those, as the Wall Street Journal points out, is we should be focused on China, and instead we go to economic war with Canada and Mexico. Second, we have cut aid in some to tiny countries in the Pacific, to the Cook Islands, to Solomon Islands, to Tonga, where we just have $1 million programs. These are the islands where my father's friends gave their blood in the last war in the Pacific, and now we're turning over control of those islands to China for to save a few $1 million. The original sin was giving China most favored nation status. Before then, their economy was tiny. The vast majority of Democrats voted against that, and we stood up to our own president. And I turn to my Republican colleagues and say, perhaps your proudest moment this year will be when you stand up to a Republican president. In capital flows, it's nice to say, well, we shouldn't send any capital to China. Keep in mind, because of that huge trade deficit, which I might add was much bigger under Trump than it was under Biden, and was even bigger still in the pre-COVID years of Trump. So Trump gave us the worst trade deficit in history vis-a China. But we are dependent for over $1.5 trillion of investment in our debt instruments on China, but we've got to look at equity flows. So believe it or not, right now we subsidize Americans who invest in Chinese stocks. We do so through our tax system and the capital gains allowance. I'm going to ask all witnesses here, please raise your hand if you believe that we should provide subsidies to Americans who choose to invest in Chinese stocks. Let the record show no hand went up. And yet, I have great difficulty. I've only gotten one Republican co-sponsor for the bill that I'm going to reintroduce. I hope all of you join me in co-sponsoring this, to say no capital gains allowance for investment in Chinese stocks. Now, I know that offends the billionaire class, but you cannot stand up to China if you're unwilling to offend the billionaire class. Mr. Doshi, I'm not able to read your sign so well, so I may have mispronounced your name. Are there unique risks for Americans when they invest in Chinese stocks, such as expropriation, that should be part of the disclosures they get from the SEC?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that there are significant risks. I'm not sure that we have, that market itself is highly volatile, unpredictable. There's no adequate auditing of these companies. Our due diligence firms.
The auditing, Senator Kennedy and I did something about, but
Yes.
there's everything else.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Delighted we're having this hearing today. I think that the panel is well positioned to provide a lot of information to us. Mr. McMurray, I want to go directly to your testimony. We're talking about China. China currently has 57 nuclear reactors in operation and 28 reactors under construction. The United States has 94 reactors, none currently evidently on the books to replace them. What is the major reason why we cannot build economic, the funding that's necessary for these? Is the market not robust? Is there not an understanding? What is the reason why America would not be building at least one or two?
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman. China, over the last several years, has made a concentrated focus on building new nuclear, and that is played out in the number of reactors under construction. I would say the U.S. has also done that. There has been significant bipartisan policy for the past several years focused along every step to build new nuclear, whether it's demonstrating early technologies, developing the fuel supply chain, providing tax credits, improving the regulatory framework. Congress has really focused on this for the last several years.
But the market has not gathered itself together to take advantage of this?
So today there are several projects that are very close to breaking ground. There are 2 research reactors that are under construction. There are several reactors through the Department of Energy's Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program that are also nearing construction, as well as several private companies that are also looking to build. So
they're trying to go to next gen, they're waiting for the newest research and development?
There is an interest in all sorts of technologies. After the Vogtle plants came online in Georgia, pairing that with the projected demand increases for electricity in the U.S., there's also a renewed interest in large reactors as well. And so it's important for policy and the market to kind of recognize all of these different technologies have a role to play domestically, because there is also an interest in all of these technologies internationally.
Yeah, well, in Texas, we have a lot of land, but a lot of that land is being grabbed up 30 and 40,000 acres at a time for solar panels, taking then agricultural ability off that land. And we know, as you alluded to, we're going to double the amount of electricity that's necessary. Do you tell me about the proposed Trump tax cuts? Will that provide more capital available for these kinds of projects to where they don't have to come to the federal government?
So focus on Texas for a moment. There's been a lot of great work out of the state to build new nuclear, including through the governor directing the Public Utilities Commission to figure out what state policies would help attract new nuclear. I think on the federal level, we've seen significant support going back to nuclear-specific tax credits that have supported the Vogtle plants, as well as existing policies that support the new technologies today. And so I think Congress has the opportunity to continue that support and continue that focus, so it can provide certainty and predictability for the companies looking to build.
Great. Well, we need them because we cannot continue to grab 30, 40, 50,000 acres to meet the needs of not just the electrical grid system, but we need it because we're going to grow exponentially. And we've got that issue. Well, I want to thank you. I think that if we're going to be a capitalist nation and want to grow and meet the demand for all this, we need to move towards what I would call all of the above. And that has to be a better reliance upon what we're doing in particular. I want to thank you very much for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, the ranking member on the House